Expect the syntax is very similar to changing the content of elements. We use the CSS function, is the only major difference. So first of all, let's get rid of our iframe and our p tag and bring back our squares. There's our square class. Great. So now we've got our circle and our two squares. There they are. So this time, what we're going to do is change the width of our squares a little bit. So the squares are a little bit wider and also a little bit taller. There they go. And we're going to return the width of the square elements when we click on them. That's the plan. So a quick little challenge for you. Can you change this function so that instead of activating whenever the circle is hovered over, it actually activates whenever a square is clicked? Alright, hopefully you did something like changed the selector to .square and the hover function to a click function. Right, so now this function will take place whenever the square elements are clicked. So let's start by selecting the square elements again. And now we want to return, their width. So all we do is we use the CSS function and then we input the CSS attribute that we want to select, in this case the width. So this little bit of code here will return the width of the square. Let's just alert that and see what it does. Great, there we go. So the width of the square is indeed 300 pixels. Obviously we could quite easily change that to return the height or the background color or the margin top or anything that you wanted to know about that square. Now, what about if we wanted to change the code so that instead of only working on squares, it actually worked on all of the elements on the page, so that when I clicked on any of them, it would return the width of that element? Well, we can do that surprisingly easily. So first of all, a quick challenge for you. Can you make this function so that it runs whenever we click any element on this page, rather than just when we click on a square? I'm hoping you changed .square to div, because that will then select all of the div elements to run when we click on them. Now this is the new bit for you. Instead of selecting the square, we now want to select the item which was clicked, or the element which was clicked. And we can do that using a JavaScript function, which is also used a lot in jQuery, called this. And that's a really useful, really powerful function which allows us to select whichever element we're dealing with at the moment. So whichever element is clicked, this function will refer to that particular element. So let's just see how that works. If I now click on the circle, it gets the width of the circle. If I click on a square, it gets the width of the square. So this is a really useful technique. We're actually selecting a number of different elements on the page and then doing something specific with that particular element which was clicked. And we do that by using the this function. Right, what about if we wanted to change the CSS of this particular element? Well, it works in exactly the same way as with the attribute function that we saw in the last video. We just put the width that we want to change it to. So let's say we want to change the width to 400 pixels. You need to put the pixels at the end of the instruction because it could be 400% or 400 EMs if you're doing it slightly differently. So let's see what that does. Click on there and it changes the width. Changes the width of that. It's no longer a circle. These are no longer squares. Great. So we've managed to change the CSS of an element when we click on it. We can do some other things too. We can hide elements when we click on them. Now, we learned to do that in JavaScript by setting the display to none. So let's just see if we can do that here as well. In fact, give it a go for yourself. See if you can change the display to none when the elements are clicked. Did you manage it? I'm hoping you did something like changed the width attribute to display and the value to none. So now when we click on any of those elements, they disappear. Great. There is a shorthand, however, in jQuery for doing that. We can actually use the hide function. So again, very simple. jQuery allows us to use a number of functions which just make our code a bit cleaner, a bit nicer, and a bit easier to look at. That just does exactly the same thing as before. So it just sets the display attribute to none. One last thing to show you. jQuery has actually got fading built in to it. So instead of using the hide function, we can use the fade out function. See how that looks? Nice. So it's got a little fade effect to it there. Now the fade out function is actually quite complicated and has a lot of power, a lot of ways that you can change it to speed up or slow down the fade or do a particular function when the fade is complete. But we won't look into all those details now. I've got a last little challenge for you. Can you make it so that when you click on the circle, the squares fade out? I hope you managed it. I would solve it by selecting the circle, because that's the element that we want to click on to run this function. And then instead of this, we want to select the squares, like that, and we want to fade them out. See if that works. If I click on the circle, out go the squares.